Okay, we're almost at 2 minutes past the hour, so we'll get started, and I'll just do the introductions whilst people are coming in. So thank you for joining, everybody. Good morning. My name is Grant Paling. I'm a product director in our product management team. So I work a lot on our global service capabilities here at Orange Cyber Defence. I also work a lot with our teams that work every day with cyber extortion and fight ransomware and these types of things on a daily basis. This is the second in our cyber extortion series. If you joined us last week, you'll know that we had my good friend Scott Walker, the head of our cyber incident response unit, joining us. So this is going to carry on a bit and expand a bit on what Scott talked about, and also go into some new areas. The title of this one is called The Value of Understanding the Ecosystem. So we're going to dive a bit deeper into the world of cyber extortion and the actors behind it. So what are we going to go through today? We're going to do a quick recap on that last webinar if you weren't able to join us last week. We're going to talk about what we know about the cyber extortion ecosystem, share a little bit of our research and some of the latest statistics with you. But more importantly, we're going to talk about how to use that knowledge to proactively mitigate the risk of cyber extortion. So moving a bit beyond what Scott talked about last week, Scott very much talked about the basics, having incident response plans in place, being prepared. And we're going to expand on that a little bit to talk about how to then go a bit further in terms of being more proactive. And then we're going to talk a bit at the end about what we see in the future, maybe some of the things we see where AI can have an impact on helping us to deal with this particular threat and to move towards not just a proactive but a more preemptive approach in cybersecurity. So that's what we've got in store for you today. So let's start with this first point, the cyber extortion ecosystem. What do we know? Well, what did we learn in part one of this series last week? If you weren't able to join us, let me do a quick recap for you. Scott, head of incident response, talked about why you should never pay in the hidden costs. You know, some of the things like legal fees associated with actually paying a ransom, the actual potential for attackers to come back afterwards. They're not the most honest of folks, so even if you pay, there's every chance they will come back in or they'll sell your data anyway. So that, you know, our recommendation was very much, rather than paying the ransom, and a more effective strategy is to look at your incident response process, being prepared for cyber extortion and doing everything you can to stop it. He also touched a bit on the why. You know, he talked a little bit about the how, some of the technical detail, but also, you know, why are these people doing this? What's the motives and the motivations, and who are the people behind it? And that's something we'll go a bit deeper into today. And then he talked about getting into more of a proactive and preventative mindset. We, of course, have to be prepared to respond, but more so, we also need to be prepared as a business to actually take what lessons we can, not just from our own breaches, but those that we see from organizations around the world who have been breached. What can we do better? And Scott shared some of his tips last week. I'm going to talk a bit more about some of what I see is something that can help you be more proactive in terms of that mindset. So we talked last week about incident response. We're going to focus a bit more this week on threat intelligence. What do we know about the ecosystem? And to know about the cyber extortion ecosystem, you need eyes and ears, and you need them everywhere. That's something that we've invested a lot in from an Orange Cyber Defence perspective. I think one of the things we focus on is extensive knowledge of the threat, especially when it comes to cyber extortion, because of the fact that this is, you know, the fastest growing cybercrime type. It's very, you know, very successful over the years, and we're going to see that in some of the statistics shortly. Our knowledge of the threat comes from various sources. We have our Security Research Center. We have people dedicated to tracking the cyber extortion ecosystem, trying to observe different trends, trying to understand the different groups that are active, where are they active, what type of businesses are they going after, in what industries and geographies. How do they differ from each other? You know, there are many cyber extortion groups now that are active and continue to be active, and no one of them is exactly the same. We also do some investment in in-house research and development to try and identify a bit more information than perhaps just research about the cyber extortion actors. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the more specifics of that, whether it's looking at what infrastructure that they're using, or whether it's actually getting hold of some of the data that they leak. A lot of it goes from our perspective into gathering as much information as possible to understand as much as we can. If you haven't already read it, we released an annual Security Navigator report. This is a summary of all of that research and includes an extensive section on cyber extortion. So that's something that if you hadn't read it, I'd recommend taking some time to have a look at that. And also, there are different perspectives. We also have our epidemiology lab. What is that? And how surprised are you that I managed to say that word correctly? I am. An epidemiology lab does quite a specific job within Orange Cyber Defense. So whilst a lot of our research is researching the open, deep, and dark web, things that are publicly accessible, and a lot of research also comes from what we gather from our security operations centers, another angle on that is to research what we see on the Orange network. Being part of the Orange group, we have some exclusive access to the Orange network to be able to try and understand what we can see there in terms of malicious traffic, malicious activity, and we have a dedicated research team for that. So we've got quite an extensive number of avenues of research that we rely on, and we use this to expand our reach to track cyber extortion groups and what they're doing, to also look at how they intersect with the general cyber criminal underground. How do they interact with perhaps other parts of the cybercrime ecosystem? And we'll touch on that in a second in more detail. We then have a team that's looking at emerging vulnerabilities, trying to understand not just what the cyber extortion groups have done, but what they're doing right now. What vulnerabilities are they leveraging? Are they actively exploiting? Because that can help us in our defense to look at where our real risk actually lies. And also, as I mentioned earlier briefly, we're also looking at where are they operating from? Where is their attacker infrastructure, and how can we go out and proactively find that? So we're going to touch on some of these topics more throughout the webinar. We have over 250 people dedicated in one way or another to research and development and investigating these types of threats, and cyber extortion is a big part of that. We also have 20% of our ethical hackers' time is spent on research as well. So we're also trying to understand how might the attackers think next, and actually having an active group of over 200 ethical hackers helps us really to understand that, to get some of those ideas to be at the leading edge of that. So to take that attacker's perspective as well. So what we also see is information from our customers. So once we've identified intelligence, we're also tracking where have we actually seen it, where have we seen particular malware being used, and that's something that comes primarily from our managed services customers, where we conduct operations such as managed detection and response, where we're actually trying to stop early stage cyber extortion attempts, and there's different types of data that we see there. The types of data, a vast quantity of data, where we will see a large amount of attacks every day from the networks and the businesses that we're monitoring 24/7. I'm also seeing more quality and qualitative data from the likes of the cyber incident response team, where, as Scott mentioned last week, sadly, often when he gets called in, the attack has progressed further, and that tends to be from companies where we're not monitoring 24/7. So the mix of those two types of data is very valuable, and it's something that we like to share and help to give the benefit of that experience. So that's really a preface to everything that I'm going to talk about and where it comes from. So what does the cybercrime ecosystem look like? We have this image in our heads of hackers in hoodies in a dark room at a laptop, you know, almost acting alone. The cybercrime ecosystem is a lot broader than that, especially when it comes to cyber extortion. Very much a business setup where you have different affiliates and partners. It's very much a mirror image of the real world. But I know we like this kind of dark room image. Let me just darken that image for you. Is that better? Does that kind of conform more? So yeah, it's a real kind of mirror image of the way that businesses operate in the legitimate world. And it's something that we've tried to visualize. One of the links we'll send you later on at the end of this presentation is a link to our Cybercrime Now interactive map. This is something we developed within our research team to share with you and share with the community what we know about different types of cybercrime and how the ecosystem works. So you can see here there's different types of cybercrime that we've put together this interactive map. So if we click on cyber extortion, we can start to see the different types of actors that are involved. You can see here the victim, malware as a service operator. Let's click on the ransomware operator. And if you click on any of the actors anywhere in this map, you can see here on the right-hand side the incoming connections. So who are they linked to? And of course, for the ransomware operator, ultimately their biggest link is to the potential victim. But there's also some outgoing connections. So what that means is who was in the chain before they got to that point where they actually launched the attack against the victim. And this is quite interesting. It shows you the number of collaborators that they will have. So you have, for example, a crypto mixing service, making sure that, of course, if they do get paid, if they are successful, they need to make sure the money goes somewhere that it can't be traced. Of course, they want to be very careful. And so there are specialists in each of these types of areas, like any kind of, I guess, interdependent business system. There are different partners who provide different functions. You have DDoS as a service. This is not used by all operators, but there are a few operators who use DDoS, for example, as a mask for the actual attack that allows them to then kind of creep in through the back door, if you like, and execute the cyber extortion. Data brokers, those who are trying to sell the actual data that they might steal during the cyber extortion attack, and so on. And this is something that you can explore again in your own time. It's something that we're using to visualize the different types of research that we do, but just looking at the number of links here shows you that this is a complex ecosystem. It is something that is not just reliant on a piece of software that is executed at the end of the attack. It goes much deeper. And that's why we tried to change the terminology the past few years to talk more about cyber extortion. Cyber extortion is the whole act, the whole process of trying to extort money from an individual, or more often these days from a business or an organization. And there's a real human focus behind that. Who wants to do it and why, and who is involved? And actually ransomware, which is typically the term that we all talk about, is just the software family. That's more the execution phase. It's one of the last steps in the chain almost. So if we spend too much time just focusing on the software family and not enough about those who are creating it, distributing it, executing it, and why, then we kind of miss a lot of information that might help us stop it in the first place. And ultimately, there can always be a ransomware variant that's never been seen before that is very difficult to detect and to block. If we focus more on that ecosystem and what we can see, then we can focus on, well, maybe there are things we can do earlier on in the chain that will help us to stop that. It's important to know what we can see as well. So I talked about our visibility. Our visibility is the best it possibly can be, but we don't see everything. What we do see is double extortion through the likes of our incident response team and our research teams. So that's where ransomware is executed and data theft also happens. So typically, whereas when ransomware and cyber extortion started it was very much targeting the encryption of systems to extort the victim. Now there's very much a trend of stealing the data first and then launching the ransomware with the data theft also as a kind of backup, a second. So even if you can unencrypt your systems, they've already stolen your data, and that's what they're going to use to really hold you to ransom when it comes to that extortion part in the chain. There's also operators who are just not even executing the ransomware anymore. They're just working with the threat of leaking your data. And for that, we see these dedicated leak sites. Of course, the weakness they have is that they have to find a way to publicly display that information to leak the data if they're going to leak it. And so that's where we have the opportunity to pick up and observe these groups. What we don't see potentially is single extortions where ransomware only occurs. As I said, we do see a lot of actors now with leak sites. It's almost par for the course, but there are still likely actors out there who are only working on executing the ransomware only. And of course, they're not doing that publicly. So there are, we can only see what we can see when there are things that we can pick up or access. So there's likely more attacks out there than maybe some of what we report. And also, where the victim has paid the ransom, of course, their data isn't leaked. Maybe they don't end up on the ransomware leak site in the first place. So there are those that potentially are hidden from our view, and as well as unsuccessful attacks. So it's very important to say, be honest about what you can see and what you can't see. So this is what we do see, and bear in mind what I've just said. This is likely not the full set of victims, but what we do track is, what we can see in terms of trends. And you'll see on this graphic two numbers, right? The number of ransomware actors that are active that we're observing, which is the blue line, and you'll see the count of number of victims that we've observed. And we usually measure these statistics quarter on quarter. So you can see over the last 5 years, moving into this year, there is, a few peaks and troughs, but generally an upward trend in the number of cyber extortion victims that we can see, and that goes hand in hand with the number of actors. So the number of actors continues exponentially to steadily grow and grow and grow. And that just means, that's expected, right? That the number of victims will grow the more there are that are taking this path towards these nefarious business activities. And what we've seen year on year so far is a growth of 29% in victims. So it's still a problem. We're still struggling with, as a global economy and as a global set of businesses to address this threat. And we see that continuously over the years that we've been measuring this. So the growth, the good news is the growth has slowed in terms of number of victims over the years. We see in 2022 there was almost a decline in the middle of 2022, but we also have a theory that was due to the geopolitical conflict going on, the outbreak of war in Ukraine, and maybe the diversion of focus for a lot of these actors towards that conflict before kind of business as usual resumed at the end of 2022 and moving into 2023, and of course now in 2024. You do still see some dips, some reductions in actors. Law enforcement do have some success that stops, almost flattens the growth for a period of time, but what we've seen over time is that then continues to grow. What we've seen already, we're just finalizing the numbers for Q2, is actually an even sharper growth of approaching 40%, I believe. We'll be publishing those numbers shortly. So where are the opportunities to stop this? There are some opportunities. There are, for example, groups such as this one, and it happened also a few years ago with Conti, which was another famous cyber extortion group, where you've seen in the cybercrime now map the number of actors that are involved. And guess what? Sometimes they fall out. Sometimes they don't want to do business anymore. Sometimes they have internal disputes. And so there are opportunities that come up every once in a while where you can really get to understand the inner workings of these groups. And that's one of the best opportunities that we have for understanding, and that's where we picked up all of this information, and where we've drawn our map from is really these types of leaks where we've been able to really understand. You can see in this case there were over 200,000 messages exchanged between these different members that were part of this group or were affiliates. You can also pick up some of the things about what campaigns they're launching, how they're doing it, what's their mode of operations, also their negotiations with the end organizations as well. So there's a lot of information you can pick up, feed back into, and almost validate some of the research that you've been doing. And then also law enforcement is quite active in trying to take down as many of these actors as possible. We're observing, coming up to 50 different actors though, and if they take one down, it's a question of how much are they going to take it down. Typically, they're seizing the infrastructure. Well, infrastructure can be created again quite easily. How many of the actors are they taking down? For example, in this case, they've arrested 4 suspects, but how many were actually active in the group? If we look at the example on the left of the screen, 49 members. If you take away 4 of those, what are the other 41 going to do? Maybe they'll lay low for a while, but likely they're going to go and join some other groups. And we can also see how prolific different victims, different groups are in terms of the number of victims. So that's some of the tracking of this ecosystem that we're doing. And actually, another resource that we have for you that's freely available is our cybercrime, cyber extortion map. This is where we're tracking the cyber extortion ecosystem continuously. We just earlier this year released our latest version, and you can see it goes all the way back to 2015. And this is a history of what we've observed. And again, we're not claiming this is everything. This is what we can observe and derive from everything that we know for the length of time that we've been tracking this, about where have these groups reformed, where have they been broken up, where have they been taken down by law enforcement. And so you've got some of the kind of key events there. And one of the things I kind of like to get across and visualize with this is that it's almost like you can chop the head off the beast, but then 2 more grow back. And it's a very dynamic and thriving ecosystem that we have to fight here. In that, when you take down, maybe a prolific actor, some of those people, they're mercenaries. They will go and find another group where their skills can be used. They'll advertise those skills, and they'll be picked up because there is, unfortunately, plenty of work for them. We look at the full scope of that ecosystem as well. That's not even the whole thing. If we zoom out a bit more, and indeed a bit more, even a bit more, yeah, that's it. I mean, that's the kind of size of the map and the size of the ecosystem that we've observed. So what can we really do with all of this information? I think that's one of the key things. I wanted to set the scene of what the ecosystem looks like, but what can we do about it? How can we use this information? Apart from, we're getting to the point now where we could create a really fancy toilet roll, probably we want to look for some more practical cybersecurity use cases than that. So how do we do that? Well, we look at different ways to take this intelligence and feed it into security operations. I'm going to focus on some of those key use cases. In general, threat intelligence is only one part of the picture. The second part is to have a good grasp on what is your attack surface in your exposure, identifying all of your assets, where they are, what kind of exposure they have, and linking that with the type of information. I mentioned earlier, for example, vulnerability researchers that are looking at these cyber extortion groups, looking at what exploits they're leveraging. Well, if they are leveraging certain exploits that try to exploit a certain vulnerability, does that vulnerability exist in your ecosystem? Can you patch it? Can we get that cycle to be fast enough that it goes from intelligence to action very quickly to shut down the window of opportunity for these cyber extortion groups. Because ultimately, as much as the cyber extortion problem is growing, your objective really is to be one of those who is just better than the other targets. And the nature of the ecosystem is they're going after the easiest targets. Typically, they're not specifically targeting most organizations. That's only where there's a crossover potentially with some kind of state-sponsored or geopolitical objectives, but that's a whole different thing altogether. If we're looking at the threat of cyber extortion, it's really about being as small a target as possible, which we know is not easy. With the amount of digital assets we have out there now, it's difficult. The amount of interconnections we have with third parties. So it's a combination of being able to shut down your attack surface and enhance your security posture, and also be prepared to detect and respond, as Scott talked about in last week's webinar. I want to talk about three ways we can harness this information that we collect to address that cyber extortion risk. I want to look at the third-party risk, because it's one thing to be prepared yourself, but of course we all work in a digital economy where we all have interdependencies with different suppliers, and third-party risk management in general is an issue, but particularly when we look at that cyber extortion angle. It may be that you've done all that you can and one of your key partners suffers a cyber extortion attack. It's something we've seen very recently in the news, obviously here in the UK, with different retailers being targeted, for example. And that reliance goes beyond just protecting yourself. It's really protecting your, looking at how can we make sure that we are aware of the risks due to any third parties. And there's a slightly different angle there, which I'm going to talk about in a second. There's also being proactive, using the knowledge of that ecosystem. We personally are not sitting here just observing. We're trying to use this information to proactively target the cyber criminals where they live and where they operate. And then there's also the use case I mentioned a second ago, knowing which vulnerabilities are being used, prioritizing patching accordingly, and reducing your exposure. So these are the three practical use cases I'm going to explore next. The first one is this cyber extortion. So, from these leak sites, from monitoring these groups, one of the things that we can do, and that is, I would say good practice, is not just to rely on what you have submitted. When you're evaluating a third party, obviously they have to go through due diligence, they may have certifications, they may answer a bunch of security questions. Ultimately, you want to complement that with some kind of proactive monitoring. And this is something that we do, and that starts with, well, if we want to observe if your data is being leaked by a third party, by cyber extortion groups or otherwise, then we want to understand, well, which data is it that's most important? What kind of keywords? Obviously, the brand itself, but also maybe secret projects, information about mergers and acquisitions, anything that might really seriously harm the revenue of the business. Once we have that data, we can look for it in these different avenues, including, for example, ransomware leak sites. One of the things that we do, for example, is when a ransomware or a cyber extortion actor leaks data, we download all of that data and we look to see if any of our customers' data is in that leak. And that's useful then for investigating potential external data breaches. So not just that knowledge of was one of your your third parties a victim of a cyber extortion attack. It's kind of one of the things that is reasonably available out there in the market, but actually to go into the data side. So not just were they breached, but was your data actually in there? Maybe it wasn't, or maybe it was, and maybe it was some high confidentiality data. So it's being able to know what your exposure is. Potentially these sorts of things may never be made public. So you want to know, using this kind of visibility, what's happening, how exposed am I, and if possible, take mitigation actions, right? Whatever you can do to protect yourself, to make sure that try and identify where that data was leaked and by who. And of course, to report on that over time, to give the assurance, that that our third-party ecosystem is in a good space or not, and to identify potential suppliers where we might have to go and have a conversation. The next part is, how do we use the knowledge of the ecosystem to target cyber criminals where they live? So like any type of cyber criminals, ransomware and cyber extortion is operated typically from command and control infrastructure. It's one of the key things that they rely on, of course, to execute their attacks and administrate them. And from our monitoring of the ecosystem, when we get knowledge of particular attack, particular malware or particular command and control frameworks that are being used, we send that into a dedicated threat research team that reverse engineers how does this work, how do they communicate with the victim, and understand those kind of patterns of communication. What we then do with that information is scan the internet, try and discover potential command and control infrastructure that might be that fits that pattern. So almost suspicious IP addresses or domains that are that match that profile, match that pattern that we've analysed. The next step, though, and the clever part, is to use a series of I would describe them as AI agents that go in and they probe that infrastructure and try and connect with it as if they were a victim. So that's there's different steps to this. The first is to identify those candidates, but if you only identify the candidates, then you can't have 100% confidence that they are what you think they are. What we really want to know is, can we actually connect to that infrastructure? And the way to do that is to simulate a victim and connect to that infrastructure, and to keep connecting that infrastructure, because of course then the clever thing you're doing is you're hiding in the noise of all the other victims that the attacker has that are connecting to that infrastructure, doing exactly to the attackers and the cyber criminals what they're trying to do to us. They're trying to hide in the noise of our networks and our daily operations. We should do the same, and this is what we are actively trying to do. That information then goes into what we call our threat intelligence data lake, gives that context of what was the IOC, what type of tools was it using, and then of course we can feed that into our customers, into you if you're subscribing to our threat intelligence feeds, or if you're using our managed services, to allow you to get ahead of these threats. And then I wanted to sort of take a demonstration of this. So this is an advisory that came out 8 days ago on the 30th of June around the latest Fog ransomware attack. So it's a fairly fresh piece of intelligence. Fog ransomware first appeared a couple of months ago, and in this advisory we pushed it out to our customers to talk about different techniques that we'd observed, and again you can see some of that on our advisory here. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is this tool, Adaptix C2. So this is a fairly recent that we've started to see attackers using this new command and control, or certainly new in terms of widespread use of this framework. And that advisory, remember, was released on the 30th of June. I just thought I'd share, and the names are masked here to protect identities, but this is some of the internal discussions that we were having a month before that advisory was released, looking at, okay, this new framework is out. We can see that the attackers, and this is one of our researchers, you'll have to excuse this in French here, some of our researchers are all over the world, of course, and they're saying, look, we've found some hosts that might fit this bill. Can we plug it into the threat research team? The threat research team has taken that away, and almost 72 hours later has said, yep, we've researched it, we've added it into that infrastructure monitoring that I just described. And then we start to see the results of that. Just diving into an example, this is an IP that we first saw about a week ago, that you can see here is then tagged with that framework. It's tagged as being this Adaptix C2. You can see we've got 100% confidence that it's malware. And you can also see the sources, and you can see on our screen here, this OCD internal, the Orange Cyber Defense Titan system. This is what is doing the attacker infrastructure monitoring. That we've seen it, we've connected to it 5 times in the past days. And actually, the interesting thing is we're monitoring over 500 different sources, or around about 500 different sources of threat intelligence. And even a week later, we've only seen it at one other source, which is a Twitter feed, which is an open source feed of IOCs where you can submit these things too. So it's really about using that knowledge of the cyber criminal ecosystem to try and find these types of infrastructure and block them before potentially if we've got a week and we've still only seen it in one other place, that's potentially a long week of exposure, where other security intelligence feeds haven't picked it up. So this is just an example of what we're doing to try and add and bolster defenses using this type of intelligence, and obviously in as short a time as possible if we look at those timelines. The final part is knowing which vulnerabilities are being used and prioritizing patching. Again, we are looking at the cyber criminal ecosystem, looking at different types of vulnerabilities, and you can see here we've got typical Microsoft Patch Tuesday update, 124 vulnerabilities being disclosed. What you need to add to that is, well, which of those have actually are actively being exploited? And what we're saying in this advisory here is that actually only one is actively being exploited. So that's the one that we should focus on patching. And of course, when it comes to cyber extortion, they are only going to focus on the vulnerabilities they can actually use. And this is part of good practice around continuous threat exposure management. So, first of all, it's about understanding your scope, being able to then discover additional scope that maybe you didn't know about, being able to, with that scope, do some scanning for vulnerabilities, prioritize those based on the actual risk, based on things like, is it actively being exploited? Is it being used by these cyber extortion groups? Being able to also validate, is there actually a path through to use that vulnerability? If it's on the internal network, for example, can anyone actually get to it? Well, that's going to be less of a concern than something that's internet facing, is publicly accessible to anybody. So that's another step in this chain, is to continuously do that. But of course, then there's the mobilization part. Can you automate, for example, any of these kind of steps? One of the things that we've done, for example, is look at, when we're managing firewalls or other external facing security infrastructure, looking at this whole, automating much of this whole chain to understand when a vulnerability is released, when it's exploitable and it affects one of these pieces of infrastructure, immediately going out and finding, well, which of the assets that we're managing is exposed. Then looking at raising cases to go and mobilize very quickly and actually update and patch those systems, so that we really reduce that window from days to a matter of hours. So that's one of the other things I would recommend is going to be effective in terms of combating the cyber extortion threat. I want to end here with just a bit about what it looks like in the future. We see things shifting continuously with cyber extortion. We see that they take up and down infrastructure, they reform. We've already seen that in the research that I've shared earlier and some of the resources that we've got. We need to be able to stay ahead of that and continue to observe it, but we also need to be able to apply it better to our infrastructure, to be able to really focus on not just knowing where the vulnerabilities are, but actually the impact and get better at mapping what's the actual attack path through to those vulnerabilities. And when it comes to detection and response, we actually need to focus on trying to remediate before impact. Given that knowledge of potentially exposed assets, is there something we can do with our existing security controls that's going to remediate that threat? Something we can automate the visibility of, that link between exposure and actually security controls, and can we make that more real-time, more linked in the chain before it gets to a situation where we have to detect and respond to that threat? And of course, can we measure this? Can we measure success by looking at this overall picture and looking at how much that we are able to reduce risk? So when we look at being more proactive, certainly our strategy, and one that we would recommend looking at as a business, is to look into how do these different capabilities all come together. You know, being able to analyze exposure management by integrating threat intelligence, being able to predict where the attackers are most likely to strike next, then understanding how are we exposed, and not only that, what does that security posture look like? And the common thread here is your security assets, is your enterprise assets, sorry, your hardware and software assets. You know, we get lots of information from different security systems about those assets. So each of them has a piece of the picture. And if we're really going to harness the power of artificial intelligence within cybersecurity, this is really one opportunity. If we can build a central picture of the assets and how exposed they are, how well protected they are, and maybe even how often we've seen them be attacked in the past, then we can start to build more of a predictive model on where attackers are likely to strike next when we put that together with threat intelligence. So this is just a view of certainly where we believe cybersecurity is going and should go, and something we'd be happy to talk to you about, of course, more in follow-up sessions. So some key takeaways. You know, the cyber extortion ecosystem is big, but because of that, it does give us opportunities to observe it. You know, it's a lot easier to track an ecosystem that relies on being interactive and relies on that communication and interdependency between different parties. So whilst cyber extortion is on the rise, there are more and more opportunities to actually track that ecosystem and use that information to do as much as we can to move from reactive to proactive. And that's where, you know, providers like ourselves are here to help on that, to help you be more proactive in any way we can, whether that's just feeding you our intelligence, whether it's giving you information, or whether it's taking part in your operations. We're here to help do that. And we do believe that innovations in AI will allow us to be more preemptive in mitigating this cyber extortion risk in the future. We hope to, as an industry, we hope that that will help us reduce the risk of cyber extortion. But of course, the cyber criminals aren't standing still either. We're out of time, so I'll just leave you with a plug for a few things. The Cybercrime Now app that I showed you is available. You can either scan the QR code or we'll send you the links afterwards to access that resource. It's freely available as a research tool, something if you want to use it in your own discussions or presentations to help visualize this issue. And also, we have a follow-up part 3 in this series next week, cyber extortion, what can we really do about it? Again, takes another angle on some innovative ways that we can battle the threat of cyber extortion. So that will be there if you're available same time next week. It'll also be recorded if you're not. That'll be the third and final part in this Challenger series. We also, my colleague will be posting in the chat a link to our podcast very shortly. We have a new podcast out from Orange Cyber Defense. Go listen to it. It also talks a bit about this type of threat, but also how it might change in the future with generative AI and some of the risks involved there. So go check it out. It's quite a light-hearted but also serious look at the threat. that's it. I'm out of time, but I will see if there are any questions from the audience. If you do have a question, please feel free to ask now. Let me see if we have one. Do we have any questions, team, in the chat? Yep, we've got one. Given the rapid growth in both victims and groups, what's your prediction for the next big shift in the cyber extortion ecosystem in the next 12 to 18 months? That's an interesting question. It's hard to predict what will happen next, but there's also some certainty. I think the certain thing we know from what the statistics and the growth patterns I showed earlier, we do expect cyber extortion to continue to grow, sadly. I think that's just due to the further digitalization of businesses and the further expansion of the attack surface. Unfortunately, that is a contributor to the rise in these attacks. The more businesses go digital, the more exposure there is. That's why it's so important that we proactively try and track that exposure. I think also we'll continue to see this theme of data exposure and data leakage from cyber criminals. And one of the things I think that they will try to leverage is any exposure in AI systems. So let's imagine you compromise a user who has access to an LLM, for example, either an internal or a public subscription, a business subscription to ChatGPT or something like that. It's going to be easier for them to find the information that they're interested in and potentially more damaging. So I expect that there will be more targeted use of these things, because exact same reason we're using them as businesses to increase our efficiency is the thing that they will try to compromise. And the easiest way to do that is to compromise a user who has access to something which has maybe more access than they do. I think we'll start to see some results of that, and I think the severity potentially of the data breaches we see that will perhaps be worse. Okay, I don't believe we have time for any more questions, but if you had one, please do feel free to ask it, and we will endeavour to get back to you with the answer. Thank you for joining me today. Appreciate your time. Hope it was a useful session. And of course, my colleagues and I at Orange Cyber Defence UK are available for a follow-up should you require us. Thanks very much, and have a nice day.